Thank you. Why don't we go on to the second speaker, Dr. Gruber.
Well, thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of today's meeting for so graciously inviting me to come and talk a little bit about this. Certainly, I can speak louder. Is that better? I'll reiterate my thanks to the organizers of today's meeting as well as the National Academies for an extraordinarily comprehensive report. Is this better? I feel like an air traffic controller. Okay. By way of disclosure, actually, before I begin, I won't go into my own educational experience necessarily, but I will say that I am a clinical researcher, I'm a neuroscientist, and I've spent the last about 2 decades looking at the impact of recreational cannabis on measures of brain structure and function and cognitive performance. A couple of years ago, we began a medical marijuana program. So I come to this in terms of addressing barriers to policy monitoring and funding in a little bit of a different way. I am funded by NIDA and have been, and our research is supported by this MIND program, but I have no conflicts of scientific or financial interest to disclose. So I actually thought I would take a little bit of a step back and look at the report and figure out some of the more salient findings, since it is a fairly comprehensive report with over 100 findings, in terms of what might be most salient or relevant to those of us in clinical research who are constantly asked what the best next steps might be. So the overwhelming take-home message for people who want to know, well, is it or isn't it effective for medical treatment? I always refer to what I call the big 3 finding of this report. There's conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are effective for the treatment of chronic pain in adults, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and muscle spasticity as it relates to multiple sclerosis. That's what the report noted. There was moderate, limited, or no evidence for other indications or symptoms. Doesn't mean there aren't countless thousands of people claiming improvement based on lots of different therapeutic regimens. That's not what the report is designed to do. It's important to keep this in mind when we talk to patients or recreational users or anyone, because in fact, this really is the big finding in terms of conclusive evidence. There are challenges and barriers to conducting cannabis and cannabinoid research. Almost every single person, regardless of what the topic of their talk has been, has mentioned this. They fall into 4 broad categories. I will touch on them very briefly in the interest of time with regard to what I think are some of the more salient points, again, for those of us who are researchers. Regulatory, supply, funding, and scientific methodology. I will also say that the things that I'm highlighting here are by no means an exhaustive list of the issues related to conducting cannabis-related research. I call this highlights, no pun intended. So in terms of regulatory challenges, Schedule I status of cannabis currently includes all cannabinoids from the plant. By definition, Schedule I substances are those defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use. So I'm often asked, or have recently been asked, much more often since this report was issued in January, is the current status then appropriate given findings from the report? Really good question, certainly one that I'm sure we're going to hear lots about today. Should non-psychoactive constituents with no potential for diversion warrant the same level of regulatory oversight? These are sort of the 2 big overarching questions which really do cut across a number of different research aspects. In order to fully understand the potential benefit and possible risks associated with cannabis use, and this is for medical or recreational use, it's really important, and this was touched on by our previous speaker, it's really important to keep this in mind. Researchers have to be able to study actual cannabis products currently available to consumers for recreational or medical use. Now, we have a lot of limitations to doing that, but that's ultimately the goal. If you want to determine if something is efficacious for your patients or consumers, you need to know what they're using. Current limitations include, but are not limited to, cannabis products currently have to be obtained from a single federal source. I think we've all heard this a number of times today. That's currently NIDA. Lab testing is limited to within state facilities. My colleague, Dr. Vandry, referred to this earlier. Also, labs with Schedule I licensure cannot really test non-federal products. Federal funds can't be used to purchase cannabis products, even if legal within the state. There's no current ability to assess commercially available hemp-derived products. We actually just had a question about this. We have countless thousands and thousands of people using these products. It is currently impossible for those of us as clinical researchers to study this using clinical trial methods. DEA regulations are often a little bit at odds with each other with regard to state versus federal considerations. For example, issuance of Schedule I licenses, and all individual constituents of the plant fall under schedule and regulations currently, regardless of their diversion potential. So some considerations. Again, these are broad strokes. Amend the CSA to make cannabis research more accessible. How do you do that? Consider expanding access to cannabis for research purposes via exemption from some Schedule I requirements, whether it's licensure. Should licensure really be required, I'm asked, by people who are interested in only studying some of the non-psychoactive cannabinoids? If there's no potential for diversion or no high abuse liability, do they really fall under the same requirements? Potential legislative efforts. I am encouraged and hopeful that we will be seeing more about things like the Medical Marijuana Research Act and the MEDS Act, Marijuana Effective Drug Studies Act. It'd be great to revisit these, figure out how best to perhaps reintroduce them and make them a viable means for perhaps surmounting some of our challenges. Scheduling of cannabis and cannabinoids. Do we categorize cannabinoids differently depending on their abuse liability and diversion potential? Should, again, constituents with no liability or diversion risk be classified in the same way? And by the way, does that extend to things that are whole plant derived? Or are we only talking about things that are extracted or purified versions, because they are wholly different? Again, no pun intended. Regulatory challenges, very briefly. I've seen lots of different flowcharts about this, and I had an animated slide that showed you exactly, or sort of kind of, what steps one has to go through to have approval. But it, again, really did look like an air traffic control map, so I boiled it down this way. Currently, you need approval from multiple agencies, which is confusing and sometimes inefficient. State versus federal regulations are currently, in some states, very often at odds with each other. In Massachusetts, we've often been told we need state approval for the DEA, and then we're told by the state we have to have federal approval first. So we go round and round. Not that we don't like paperwork or getting on the phone with our local folks, because we do, and we get to know them very well. But in fact, this is one of the issues. Contradictory policies between agencies is yet another one. Some folks will issue sort of a statement regarding a mandate that is certainly not necessarily held by the DEA in terms of Department of Health versus the DEA, for example, in our case. There's a somewhat circular approval process currently. Approval from one agency is often wholly dependent on approval from another agency. And again, without the animation here, it's perhaps possible that approval could follow a slightly more linear process where researchers submit an IND to the FDA, they deal with their Schedule I registration, and that then ticks off the state requirements in sort of a much more linear way. You apply for IRB approval and ultimately wind up with a clinical trial if, in fact, that's the goal. Just one thought, but clearly what we need is a slightly more clarified, linear process. I've had lots of stories from colleagues who tell me it takes countless months and months just to get feedback on where they are in the application process. So NIDA is currently the only source of cannabis material for researchers. And again, let's start with the current state before we talk about ways to improve it. Quality may not be optimal. It's not their fault. Many strains have to be frozen after harvest, which of course could degrade the product. We know that changes over time, as well as long-term storage. Things change with regard to the chemical compounds themselves over time. Lack of what I call ecological or external validity. Potency and constituent ratios may not be consistent with street products or those from dispensaries. Forgive the term street products, but in terms of what we think of as our recreational consumers, that's how they refer to it. And most importantly, actually, or very importantly, doesn't necessarily reflect the current range and types of products and modes that people are currently using. Again, I spend a lot of time with recreational cannabis consumers, and I can tell you, although NIDA has expanded their platform significantly, we don't see the products that are currently being used. There's also no current availability or ability to study widely over-the-counter available products. These, for example, are those that are hemp-derived. So we have, again, the ability for people to access these products, buy the products, use the products, but no ability to study them in an empirically sound, systematic way. I think that's a problem. Progress. NIDA's DSP, the Drug Supply Program, has exponentially expanded availability of conventional flower products, which vary in constituent composition. We now have flower products that are low, medium, and high in terms of THC and also CBD. They also outline a number of other cannabinoids because there are hundreds of constituents in the plant. And when I have our samples analyzed for what we call the top 10 cannabinoid constituents, there are potentially lots of different areas to be researched here. In 2016, as our previous speaker noted, the DEA began accepting applications from non-NIDA entities to grow, manufacture, and supply cannabis for research purposes. At this point, NIDA remains the only source. Additional considerations. So, again, sort of following up with what Teddy said earlier, perhaps we should consider mechanisms to allow growers and providers, especially those with large cohorts, perhaps of patients or consumers, and product lines, to have their products tested, vetted, and ultimately made available to researchers in order to assess the actual impact of available products that people are actually using. There's lots of different mechanisms, lots of different ways this could happen, but it seems to me that facilitating this particular route might actually give us some answers in the short term. Facilitating assessment of products via clinical trials. This is specifically with regard to concentrate products. So we've heard Ryan mentioned earlier, we have lots of different products. Our folks use wax, shatter, butter, dabs. For those of you who don't know, these are products that are engineered to be very high in THC, not our national average of about 12%, although in Massachusetts our average is about 18%, 16 to 18%. These products go north of 60, 70, and 80%. Yet we have no ability to study the impact of these products. Medical and recreational dispensaries supplied, we don't currently have a legal means of studying these with regard, again, to a clinical trial method, and again, over-the-counter products. Funding challenges, very briefly, I probably don't have to explain this to this particular audience, but NIDA's mission statement really is to advance science on the causes and consequences of drug use and addiction and to apply that knowledge to improve individual and public health. NIDA currently funds the majority of cannabis research in order to assess the impact of recreational use and misuse. And we heard earlier in our first session about the largest longitudinal study designed to look at the impact of cannabis, along with lots of other variables, far too many for me to mention, on the developing brain, which is certainly an issue. A portion of NIDA-funded studies also investigate the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids, but those currently make up a small portion of the portfolio. So what do? Since there have been claims, and again, this report has clarified the effect in terms of, again, what we think of as conclusive or substantial evidence, perhaps we focus on other NIH institutes and centers that are designed to clarify the effect on specific diseases or processes. Do we increase RFAs for research investigating cannabinoids for muscle spasticity in MS, for example, and TAP NINDS, chemotherapy or cancer-related indications, for example, from the National Cancer Institutes? NIDA isn't necessarily the only institute that should be involved. Do we create a new center at NIH designed specifically to fund studies assessing potential therapeutic benefits of cannabis? We certainly have spent an awful lot of time and energy looking at what the report has found, and we talk about, different ways to, again, move the ball forward. Is this a way we want to go? Potential incentives for industry to invest in cannabis research, particularly medical cannabis initiatives. Scientific challenges, I won't spend much time on this other than to say, again, we heard a little bit about this earlier. Currently, in terms of some of the challenges, we have challenges with regard to drug delivery systems, smoking versus vaporizing versus dabbing, oral or sublingual treatments or products. We heard again from Ryan that these things certainly look very different over time and with regard to overall effect. We don't have any data yet, again, on concentrates. How comparable are methods of administration or time course? We have little research on the benefits or downsides of these routes of administration, and we've got no data on the effect of exposure to individuals who are using concentrates that are derived from solvent-based extraction methods like butane hash dabs, right, BHOs. What happens when you have somebody who's got residual exposure to butane or hexane versus those with solventless concentrate exposure? And we have no standardized assessments of cannabis exposure, no standardized queries necessarily for examining cannabis exposure with regard to frequency and magnitude across product types. Is one hit from a blunt, that's a pretty traditional product that's being used, really comparable to a .025 dab in terms of concentrate or exposure? Limitations in self-report data are just that, limitations, and biological samples we know have limited utility. So we need additional studies to look at best research practices from modes of use additional comparisons of plant versus concentrates versus edibles, proper dosing, development of consistent, reliable delivery devices is critical. How do we determine the most efficacious strains for specific indications or symptoms? We need to look at profiles of individual cannabinoids versus those that are whole plant derived. This is a huge area of interest for our group and many others. Exploration of impact of higher potency products. Most of what we know about cannabis comes from studies of recreational users, either fairly naive folks who are not regular users, or in our studies, fairly consistent users. We need to look at the impact of higher versus medium and low potency products, clinical indications for use, long-term implications, you name it. Exploring the possibility of harm reduction through mandatory constituent ratios in products, especially for our consumers who are at their most vulnerable periods. Do we mandate that there's a minimum amount of cannabidiol, which has been touted to mitigate some of the negative effects of THC in our youngest consumers, perhaps in states with legalization of recreational products? Lab testing of currently available products should be mandatory. People should know, quote, what's in their weed. People ask me all the time, how do I figure it out? And development of appropriate lab test procedures per product type. Is it really appropriate to test oils the same way we test edibles, sublingual tinctures? There's a lot of work to be done here. We can't assume it's all been done and figured out. Really quickly, we began something called the MIND program about 2 years ago. It's a research program designed to look at the impact of medical marijuana on cognition, clinical state, quality of life, and where applicable, measures of brain structure and function and related measures. We support a number of projects designed to look at cannabinoid-based therapies for a range of indications and conditions, and we use, as best we can, primarily observational, longitudinal observational, cross-sectional survey, and clinical trial models. Very quickly, an observational study that's currently underway, which was designed, as I just mentioned, to look at each of those aspects. The point here is we look at folks before they begin a medical marijuana regimen. That is, we capture them before they start treatment. We follow them over the course of 1 year. We just got approval to follow them to 24 months. They can use any product that they want for their use. We record it throughout the study, and actually their most commonly used products are tested by an outside laboratory for cannabinoid constituent content. It may not be perfect, but it's better than not having them tested at all, since we can't give them the products. We're having their products tested. I won't go through the inclusion criteria, but folks have to be THC negative at baseline. We're trying very hard to exclude individuals who are current recreational cannabis users to look at the potential effects of using a medical or cannabis or marijuana. Their certification can be for a range of indications, by the way. Our first paper, it's a very small study thus far, looked at 28 patients at baseline, 11 of whom by the time we went to publication had come back for their second visit, which was 3 months of treatment. And in general, we saw some improvement on measures of executive functioning, these cognitive measures, things like the Stroop color word test and trail making test, mostly reflected as increased speed without loss of accuracy. So the question was, did they get worse after using medical cannabis products? Do they look worse? And the answer is, so far, not so much. We've expanded this. We now have more patients. We also saw moderate improvements in clinical state, including reduced sleep disturbance, decreased depression, and attenuated impulsivity, and some improvements in quality of life. And they did report a notable decrease in their use of conventional pharmaceuticals. Most strikingly, opioids went down about 42%. But this is a tiny study. Again, it's a really promising area of investigation, but it's small. So future directions, we know policy has outpaced science. Now, as researchers, we have to sort of do the best we can to provide accurate information about safety and effects, both positive and negative. Recreational use is prevalent, both legally and illegally. So is medical use. Our previous speaker mentioned there's over 1 million medical cannabis users. It's like 1.3 and growing, and that doesn't count people who are using products that they don't need certifications for. So we need high quality research to maintain scientific integrity, but we need efficiency to keep up with the pace of changing culture of marijuana use or cannabis use, ecological validity to assess what patients and consumers are actually using, expand our funding sources, so it's not necessarily just NIDA. We need to look at medical efficacy for clinical indications, dosage, and product strain and assessment, and recreational use. Public safety demands accurate information about potential harms and risks. It's imperative to balance, when we think about this, rigorous monitoring with safety with clinical need and scientific inquiry, and our growing numbers of consumers, because the number of people who are using cannabis for medical or recreational use is growing every year. And with that, I would thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Gruber. I think we have time for a question or two. Anyone?
I was wondering if I could read a few headlines that came out following this report. The National Academy of Sciences deems marijuana an effective medicine. Science once again claims marijuana as medicine in landmark National Academy of Sciences report. National Academy of Sciences says marijuana has medical benefits. Scientists release definitive study, marijuana as medicine. Is that what the IOM report says?
Again, I always think of the sort of top three, and I think the report was intended to take a very broad view of what we know based on cannabis research thus far. I think the terms, and again, I'm not one of the authors of the report, so I'm limited in my ability to speak to this since I didn't review the studies. But I think the sort of overarching take-home message is that despite the number of indications and conditions for which individuals and groups are touting improvement and efficacy, there's a lot yet to be done in terms of research. There's certainly considerable evidence, again, for those, I hate to refer to it as this, but the top three in terms of pain, muscle spasticity, and nausea and vomiting related to chemotherapy. I think it's, again, clear that we need more research in order to make some statements about other indications for which people are clearly using and anecdotally and perhaps in smaller studies reporting some improvements.
But does the report say that cannabis is effective at treating pain? I mean, it says cannabis or cannabinoids, but it seems like these headlines are interpreting it to mean cannabis, raw marijuana, is effective at treating pain.
So again, not being one of the folks who authored this particular study, I think there were studies that were reviewed that looked at extracted products from whole plant as well as individuals who are using whole plant products. So I'm not sure I'm the person to answer that particularly